I'm Garrett Holloway, 44 years old. For the past 15 years, I've been operating Oceanic Depths, a scuba diving instruction facility along the Carolina coastline. If you've never been to this part of North Carolina, picture endless stretches of beach, small harbor towns where everyone knows everyone, and some of the best diving spots on the East Coast. That's where I built my life, or at least what I thought was my life. Built the whole operation from scratch after finishing my time with the Navy, teaching people how to experience what's beneath the surface, while my spouse, Natasha, took care of the financial side of things. We met when I was 22 and she was 21, both young and full of dreams about building something together. 22 years of marriage, and I genuinely believed we had something solid. Partnership, mutual respect, genuine affection. We'd weathered financial struggles in the early years, celebrated successes together, supported each other through family losses. Or at least I thought we had. That particular Tuesday evening shattered every assumption I'd been living with, every memory I'd been holding on to. I was in the garage maintaining my diving equipment when I heard the distinct sound of high heels crossing the kitchen tiles. That alone was weird because Natasha practically lived in running shoes when she was home. Comfort over style had always been her motto, or so I thought. I walked inside and found her standing in front of the hallway mirror, smoothing down a black dress that hugged every curve. The dress looked expensive, designer label expensive, definitely not her usual book club attire, which typically consisted of jeans and a sweater. I asked where she was headed, wiping grease off my hands with an old rag. She turned around, and that's when I noticed something different in her expression. Her eyes had this cold glint I'd never seen before. Not the warmth I'd fallen for decades ago, but something calculating and cruel. Something that made my stomach drop even before she spoke. She announced she had a date planned for the evening, speaking as casually as if she were mentioning a grocery run. Then she added that little comment about not getting too jealous, like this was all some amusing game she was playing. I just stood there, holding that greasy towel, watching the woman I'd spent over 2 decades with actually laugh at how stunned I looked. Not an uncomfortable laugh or anything apologetic. She was genuinely entertained by my reaction, like she'd been waiting for this moment and was savoring every second of my confusion. I managed to repeat the word back to her, my voice sounding distant in my own ears. She confirmed it with a shrug, grabbed her handbag, checked herself in the mirror one more time, and with this satisfied smile, and told me not to bother staying awake for her return. 1,000 questions flooded my brain. Who was this person? Where were they going? How long had this been happening behind my back? Was this the first time, or had there been others? Did our entire marriage mean nothing? But instead of asking any of that, instead of yelling or demanding answers like she probably expected, I said something that made her pause halfway to the door. I told her to have fun explaining all this to her sister the next day. Her confidence flickered for just a moment. She asked what I meant by that, and I just said it was nothing, told her to enjoy herself. My voice was calm, almost friendly, which clearly unsettled her more than anger would have. But it definitely wasn't nothing. Natasha's sister Diane lived just a few blocks away and had this habit of showing up without warning. Morning coffee visits, afternoon check-ins, random evening drop-bys. More importantly, Diane had been making pointed comments lately about how frequently these book club gatherings seemed to happen for a group supposedly reading one book monthly. She'd mentioned it to me twice in the past month, asking if I thought Natasha was actually enjoying these meetings or just using them as an excuse to get out of the house. At the time, I'd defended Natasha, said she needed social time with friends. Now those conversations took on a completely different meaning. After Natasha left, I sat in my chair staring at nothing in particular. The television was on, but I wasn't watching it. The clock ticked on the wall, but I wasn't hearing it. 22 years of what I thought was a solid relationship, and she'd just announced her infidelity like she was heading out for a workout session. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal itself, though that cut deep enough. It was how effortless it seemed for her, how little our entire history apparently mattered in her mind. No guilt, no hesitation, no remorse, just cold amusement at my shock. I poured myself some whiskey and started thinking strategically. Years of dive instruction had taught me that panicking underwater is the fastest way to die. You stay composed, evaluate your situation, formulate a plan. When you're 60 feet down and something goes wrong with your equipment, you don't flail around or rush to the surface. You breathe, you think, you act deliberately. Same principles applied here. By the time I finished that drink, I knew exactly what my next steps needed to be. This wasn't going to be an emotional reaction. This was going to be calculated, methodical, and thorough. The following morning, Natasha behaved as if absolutely nothing had occurred. She was humming while preparing coffee, asked about the weather forecast, mentioned something about needing to pick up groceries later, even gave me a quick kiss before I headed to the facility. If I hadn't witnessed her walking out in that black dress 12 hours prior, if I hadn't heard those words come out of her mouth, I might have questioned whether I'd hallucinated the entire incident. But I knew what I'd seen, what I'd heard. The question now was what I was going to do about it. But I'm methodical by nature. 2 decades in the Navy plus 15 years managing a business teaches you to document absolutely everything. Paper trails matter. Evidence matters. Assumptions get you eliminated. Facts keep you alive. So when I arrived at Oceanic Depths, I started investigating. First stop was our shared banking account. Natasha had always handled most of our finances, insisting she had a better head for numbers. I'd been happy to let her manage it because I was focused on the diving side of things, on building the business and keeping customers safe. Now I was wondering what else she'd been managing without my knowledge. 3 cash withdrawals over the past month, each one for $300. Our credit card showed charges at restaurants I'd never visited, places with names like Moonlight Bistro and the Velvet Room, a hotel over in Wilmington, and something called Sensual Secrets Boutique. Each charge was like a punch to the gut. My dive certification required maintaining composure under extreme pressure, but seeing those receipts felt like nitrogen narcosis, that dangerous euphoria that hits when you descend too deep. Everything became simultaneously crystal clear and absolutely terrifying. The woman I'd trusted with our finances had been funding her affair with our money right under my nose for months. I contacted our bank requesting comprehensive statements covering the previous 6 months. The representative on the phone was helpful, probably heard the stress in my voice, said they'd have everything ready by end of business day. Then I drove him to that Wilmington hotel and had a conversation with the front desk employee, a young woman named Jasmine, who immediately recognized Natasha from the photo I showed her. Her face lit up with recognition, which made my stomach sink even further. She mentioned that Mrs. Holloway had been there multiple times with her companion Damien, describing them as such a lovely couple. She even commented on how romantic they seemed together, always holding hands in the lobby. Damien. That name detonated in my brain like an underwater explosive. I knew exactly who that was. Damien Blackwood had taken diving lessons from me about 3 years back. Somewhere in his 40s, worked in real estate, recently divorced and clearly bitter about it. Always making inappropriate comments toward female customers, standing too close, finding excuses to touch their shoulders or adjust their equipment when they didn't need help. I'd actually banned him from the facility after catching him photographing women in their wetsuits without permission, claiming he was just documenting his diving experience. Now apparently he was photographing my spouse in hotel rooms and probably doing a lot more than that. Back at the shop, I reached out to my old Navy connections. Tommy Vasquez now worked for a private investigation company in Charlotte. We'd literally saved each other's lives during our deployment in the Persian Gulf. One of those bonds you can't break no matter how much time passes. When I called and explained the situation, the affair, the hotel, the financial irregularities I was discovering, Tommy listened to everything without interrupting. Then he gave me advice that would alter the entire trajectory of this situation. He told me not to confront Natasha yet. Explained that people caught cheating behave like trapped animals, destroying evidence and fleeing. I needed documentation first. Photographs, recordings, financial records. Build the case properly before making any moves. I protested that this wasn't some military operation, that this was my marriage falling apart. Tommy's voice got serious. He pointed out that my spouse was essentially waging war on our marriage, and I was the only combatant without ammunition. Time to arm myself properly. He said he'd start digging on his end, but I needed to act completely normal at home. Could I do that? I said I could, even though the thought of pretending everything was fine made me feel sick. That evening, I installed a small recording device in our living area. Not for spying purposes exactly, but for protection. If Natasha was going to demolish our marriage, she wasn't going to demolish my reputation alongside it. When she arrived home late again with another book club excuse, I simply nodded and asked how the discussion went. She claimed they'd had a fascinating conversation about betrayal in relationships, not even making eye contact. The irony almost made me laugh out loud. Instead, I kissed her goodnight and went to bed, where I lay awake formulating my strategy, listening to her breathe beside me and wondering who this stranger in my bed really was. Tommy's investigation progressed faster than anticipated. By Friday, he'd discovered something that made my blood freeze. Natasha hadn't just been having an affair. She'd been systematically liquidating our assets. Tommy told me I needed to sit down for what he was about to reveal. My spouse had taken out a second mortgage on my dive facility. $200,000 using falsified documents. I insisted that was impossible because I'd never signed anything. Tommy explained she'd had assistance. Damian Blackwood worked for Shoreline Realty, and they had connections with several mortgage brokers. Someone had fabricated the paperwork. I asked where the money went. Tommy said it was gone, transferred to an offshore account the previous month. Then he dropped the real bomb. They were planning to vanish completely. That evening, Natasha came home with shopping bags from high-end stores. New luggage, designer clothing, jewelry we definitely couldn't afford on our legitimate income. The woman who used to obsessively clip coupons was spending money like it was infinite. I asked if there was a special occasion, watching her show off her purchases. She said a woman deserves quality things, then added that I'd been so focused on my little diving business that I'd forgotten she had needs too. My little diving business, the one she'd just mortgaged without my knowledge or consent. I commented that her purchases must have been expensive, keeping my voice neutral. She shrugged and said we could afford it, asking if business hadn't been good. I wanted to confront her immediately, but Tommy's advice kept echoing in my head. Build the case first. So I smiled and agreed, playing the clueless husband while my entire world disintegrated around me. That night I contacted my attorney, Douglas Pemberton. We'd served together in the Navy before he attended law school. I explained everything, and Douglas's response was immediate. He said this was fraud, criminal fraud. We needed to freeze my assets immediately and contact authorities. I asked what would happen to Natasha. Douglas asked why I cared, pointing out she'd committed multiple felonies, forgery, fraud, theft. She was looking at serious prison time. By Sunday morning, I had emergency court orders freezing all our accounts and preventing any additional property transfers. I also discovered something else. Natasha's mother, Patricia, had no idea what her daughter was planning. Patricia called that afternoon, her voice trembling. She mentioned that Natasha had asked about moving to Florida with a new friend and had requested a $10,000 wire transfer for a business opportunity. Something felt wrong to her. I told Patricia everything. The affair with Damian, the stolen money, all of it. By the end of our conversation, she was crying and apologizing for her daughter's actions. She said she'd raised Natasha better than this and asked what she could do to help. That's when I realized I had an ally within the family, and that's when my plan truly began taking shape. Monday morning brought a revelation that changed the entire situation. Tommy called with information that made my hands shake. Natasha had been in contact with Detective Raymond Caldwell from Wilmington Police. They'd been meeting privately. I knew that name. Caldwell had been involved in several questionable cases over the years, with rumors of evidence mysteriously disappearing and charges getting dropped for the right price. I asked Tommy if he thought Caldwell was corrupt. Tommy said he believed my spouse had been paying for protection. If I'd gone to local police with this, Caldwell would have ensured the case vanished. That explained Natasha's confidence, her casual attitude about the entire affair. She thought she had insurance. Tommy suggested we go federal. Since they'd moved money offshore, it crossed state lines. FBI doesn't answer to local cops. That afternoon, I met with FBI agent Veronica Hutchinson in a coffee shop an hour outside town. I presented everything. The financial fraud, the forged documents, Caldwell's involvement. Agent Hutchinson listened carefully, taking detailed notes. She told me I'd uncovered a significant operation, that this wasn't just about my marriage anymore. I asked what she meant. She explained that Damian Blackwood and Raymond Caldwell had been under investigation for real estate fraud. My spouse may have stumbled into something substantially bigger than a simple affair. Agent Hutchinson explained they'd been tracking a network of corrupt officials and real estate agents, specializing in property theft and money laundering. Natasha and Damian had unknowingly provided the missing pieces of their investigation. She said I needed to act normal for a few more days and asked if I could manage that. I nodded and asked what would happen to Natasha. Agent Hutchinson said that depended on how cooperative she chose to be. That evening, Natasha announced she was going out of town for a spa weekend with some girlfriends. She'd be leaving Thursday and returning Sunday. I said it sounded relaxing, knowing perfectly well she'd be meeting Damien to finalize their escape plan. Natasha seemed surprised by my casual response, asking if I minded. I replied that she deserved a break and should take all the time she needed. I watched her pack her new luggage, including documents she thought I hadn't noticed. Bank account numbers, flight confirmations, even a counterfeit passport with her photo and a different name. Thursday morning, I kissed Natasha goodbye and watched her drive away. She thought she was heading toward freedom. Instead, she was driving directly into a federal investigation that would destroy everything she'd built with Damien. I called Agent Hutchinson as soon as Natasha's vehicle disappeared around the corner. I told her Natasha was moving and whatever they were planning, now was the time. Hutchinson replied that things were already in motion and suggested I stay close to my phone because things were about to get complicated very quickly. Friday afternoon, Agent Hutchinson called with the final details. They'd intercepted communications between Natasha and Damien. They were planning to meet that evening at the Harbor View restaurant on Pier Street. They thought they were celebrating their escape. I mentioned that location was 3 blocks from where my mother-in-law lived. Hutchinson said that was perfect, that we needed witnesses for what came next. I called Patricia and explained the plan. Her voice was steady despite everything we'd discovered about her daughter. She said she'd been thinking about this all week, that Natasha's father would be ashamed if he were alive to see what she'd become. They'd raised her with values, but somewhere along the way she'd lost them. I asked Patricia to call Natasha and invite her to dinner that evening, to tell her she wanted to discuss something important about the family. Patricia said Natasha would suspect something. I suggested mentioning chest pains and wanting to see her before any medical tests. Natasha would come. That evening, I arrived at Harbor View restaurant to find Patricia already seated with Natasha's brother Christopher and his spouse Lauren. They looked anxious but determined. Natasha had agreed to dinner, thinking her mother was having health issues. At 7:30, Natasha walked in expecting a family medical crisis. Instead, she found me sitting at the table with her relatives and a stack of manila envelopes. The look on her face was absolutely priceless. Her confident smile evaporated instantly. She asked what I was doing there, her voice cracking slightly. I told her calmly to sit down because we needed to talk. She asked her mother what was going on, remaining standing with her designer handbag clutched against her chest like protective armor. Patricia spoke first, telling Natasha that I'd shown her some very disturbing information about her recent activities. I placed the first envelope in front of each family member, instructing them not to open yet because I wanted Natasha to explain first. She asked explain what, her voice getting higher and more defensive. I asked quietly where she'd been getting money for her new lifestyle, specifically the $200,000 she'd stolen by forging my signature on loan documents. The color drained completely from Natasha's face. She said I was being ridiculous and paranoid again. Christopher opened his envelope and gasped, asking if she'd really done this. Natasha started to say she could explain, but I held up my hand. I told her she'd said not to be jealous when she went on her date, and that I wasn't jealous anymore. Just disappointed that 22 years of marriage had meant so little to her. That's when she froze completely, realizing I knew everything. Agent Hutchinson appeared at our table with her badge visible, placing Natasha under arrest for bank fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Natasha finally looked at me with something resembling the woman I'd married. She begged me, saying we could work this out. I replied that we could have, before she decided to destroy everything we'd built together. Saturday morning brought news that the entire operation was unraveling. Agent Hutchinson called while I was having coffee with Patricia, who'd insisted on staying close during the arrest aftermath. They'd arrested 6 people in the network, including Detective Caldwell. My spouse's cooperation had led them to bank accounts in 3 different countries. I asked what Natasha had told them. Everything, apparently. Damien Blackwood was running a sophisticated operation targeting small business owners across the Southeast. They'd been operating for 5 years before targeting me. Patricia set down her coffee cup and asked how many families they'd destroyed, 23 that they'd identified so far, and my daughter's testimony was helping them contact all the sufferers. I felt sick thinking about other men who'd experienced what I had. Families torn apart by calculated deception. Agent Hutchinson continued with something else that made my stomach drop. Damien had been planning to homicide me, make it look like a diving accident. My spouse had refused to participate, which is why they had accelerated the financial theft instead. The room went completely silent. Patricia grabbed my hand, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't believe he'd been planning to homicide her son-in-law. Hutchinson explained the plan had been to drain the accounts, eliminate me, and have Natasha inherit everything. As the grieving widow, she would have disappeared within a month with a new identity. I stared out the window at the harbor where I'd spent 15 years building my business, asking how close they'd come. Hutchinson said Damien had already purchased the equipment needed to sabotage my diving gear. If I hadn't discovered the affair when I did, I'd probably be dead within the week. That afternoon, I visited Natasha in the county jail. She sat across from me in an orange jumpsuit, looking smaller and older than I'd ever seen her. She insisted she'd never agreed to the homicide plan. That's why she'd tried to tell me about the affair. She thought if I divorced her, Damien would leave me alone. I pointed out she could have just told me the truth. She said she was scared, that Damien had threatened to eliminate both of us if she betrayed him. Her voice broke as she acknowledged that didn't excuse what she'd done, but she'd felt trapped. I studied my spouse's face, searching for any trace of the woman I'd loved for 22 years. I mentioned the prosecutor said she might get 15 years if she cooperated fully. She said she knew, that she was going to testify against all of them. It wouldn't bring back what she'd destroyed, but maybe it would help the other families. As I left the jail, I felt something unexpected. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of closure. Natasha had made terrible choices, but at least she'd drawn the line at homicide. That evening, Tommy called with the final piece of the puzzle. The FBI had recovered most of my money. The offshore accounts were being frozen and funds returned to sufferers. I might actually come out of this financially intact. I asked about Oceanic Depths. Tommy said the business was mine, the forged mortgage was void, and the insurance company was covering legal costs. I could rebuild. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could actually breathe again. 3 months after Natasha's arrest, I stood on the deck of my boat watching the sun rise over the Atlantic. Oceanic Depths was operating again, and bookings were actually stronger than before the scandal. Turns out, people appreciate businesses run by honest individuals who've been tested by fire. Patricia had become an unexpected source of support. She'd moved into Natasha's old office at the dive center, helping manage bookings and customer relations. Her presence helped fill the void left by 22 years of shared partnership, even if that partnership had been built on lies. One morning, Patricia called from the office window that I had a visitor. I looked up to see a woman in her 30s walking down the pier. Professional attire, confident stride, but something familiar about her face. She introduced herself as Melissa Hutchinson, Agent Veronica Hutchinson's sister. She ran a sufferers advocacy group for financial fraud cases. I shook her hand, noting the family resemblance, and asked what I could do for her. She explained they were organizing a support network for people affected by Damien Blackwood's operation. 23 families had lost everything to that network. They needed to hear from someone who'd survived it intact. The idea of helping other sufferers appealed to me. These men had experienced exactly what I'd gone through: the betrayal, the financial devastation, the questioning of every memory. I asked what that would involve. She said speaking at support meetings, sharing my story, showing them that recovery was possible. Many of these men were contemplating self-destruction. They felt like failures. That afternoon, I attended my first support group meeting at a community center in Raleigh. 12 men, ages ranging from 35 to 60, all with the same haunted expression I'd seen in my own mirror 3 months earlier. Melissa introduced me, explaining that my spouse had been part of the Blackwood network, but I'd managed to expose the operation and recover my assets. A man named Gregory spoke first, asking how I'd known something was wrong. He'd lived with his spouse for 8 years and never suspected anything. I admitted I didn't know, that I'd gotten lucky. My spouse had gotten careless, and I had the right friends in the right places. But mostly I'd refused to let the betrayal destroy my ability to think clearly. Another man, William, looked up from his hands and said they'd taken his construction company, his house, his kids' college funds, everything he'd built over 15 years gone. I told him the FBI had recovered 70% of the stolen assets. He'd get most of it back. But William asked about trust, how you ever believe in anyone again. That was the question I'd been wrestling with myself. I told them you don't start with trust. You start with verification. You build trust slowly with people who earn it through consistent actions over time. After the meeting, William approached me privately, mentioning he'd heard my mother-in-law had helped expose her own daughter. That must have been difficult for everyone. I replied that Patricia had chosen what was right over what was easy. That's the kind of person you can trust, someone willing to do the hard thing when it matters. That evening, I called Patricia to tell her about the support group. She said she was proud of me for helping those men. Natasha had destroyed a lot of lives, but I was helping rebuild them. I corrected her, saying we were helping rebuild them. I couldn't do this without her support. As I hung up, I realized something important. The network of lies that had surrounded my marriage was being replaced by a network of truth and mutual support. That felt like genuine progress. 6 months after the arrests, I received an unexpected phone call that would change everything again. Captain Jennifer Walsh from the Coast Guard Investigative Service said they needed my expertise on a case involving underwater evidence recovery. I asked what kind of case. She explained that Damian Blackwood wasn't just running financial schemes. They'd discovered he was using diving operations to smuggle pills through coastal waters. They needed someone with my technical diving skills and investigative experience. The irony was absolutely perfect. The skills Damian had tried to destroy were now being used to expose his broader criminal activities. That afternoon, I met Captain Walsh at the Coast Guard station. She showed me underwater footage of sealed containers attached to artificial reefs, the same reefs where I'd been teaching diving for 15 years. Walsh explained they believed Blackwood's network had been using recreational dive sites to transfer contraband. They'd hide packages underwater during legitimate diving excursions, then retrieve them later. I asked how I could help. She said they needed someone who knew these waters intimately and could spot unusual underwater modifications. Someone the local diving community trusted. I studied the footage, recognizing several sites where I'd taken customers. The thought that pill smugglers had been operating in my territory while I was obliviously teaching families to explore marine life made my blood boil. I asked when we'd start. The investigation took 3 weeks. Using oceanic depths as cover, I guided Coast Guard divers to suspicious sites while maintaining normal business operations. We discovered 17 hidden caches containing cocaine, heroin, and illegal weapons. The final breakthrough came when we found Damian's personal diving logs hidden in a waterproof container. They detailed 5 years of smuggling operations, identifying corrupt harbor officials, and documenting bribes paid to local law enforcement. Captain Walsh told me as we surfaced from the final dive that this evidence was going to destroy the entire coastal smuggling network. I'd helped them solve crimes spanning multiple states. That evening, Patricia and I sat on the dive center's deck watching the sunset paint the water golden. She said my father would be proud. I'd turned something terrible into an opportunity to help others. I asked if she meant Natasha's father. She said no, my father. He'd raised a man who fights for what's right even when it's difficult. I thought about that for a long time. My own father had died when I was in the Navy before he could see me build Oceanic Depths or marry Natasha. Maybe he would have been proud of how I'd handled the crisis. I told Patricia I'd been thinking about expanding the business, adding a sufferers advocacy component, working with law enforcement on marine investigations. She said that sounded perfect, that I'd found my true calling. 2 weeks later, the local newspaper ran a feature story about Oceanic Depths' role in exposing the smuggling network. The headline read, "Local dive instructor helps Coast Guard. Bust multi-state pill ring." Bookings doubled overnight. Apparently, customers wanted to learn diving from someone who'd proven his character under pressure. More importantly, I'd found a new sense of purpose. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed me had actually revealed strengths I didn't know I possessed. 1 year after Natasha's arrest, I stood in a federal courthouse, watching her receive her final sentence. 15 years for fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. Damian Blackwood got life without parole for homicide, conspiracy, and pill trafficking. Detective Caldwell received 25 years for corruption and evidence tampering. Patricia sat beside me, her hand steady on my arm as the judge read the verdict. Her daughter's choices had destroyed their family, but Patricia had chosen justice over blood loyalty. The court recognized that Mrs. Holloway's cooperation was instrumental in dismantling this criminal network, Judge Harrison said. However, the severity of these crimes demanded substantial punishment. Natasha looked back at us one final time before the bailiff led her away. I saw neither the woman I'd married nor the stranger who'd betrayed me, just someone who'd made choices that destroyed multiple lives, including her own. After the sentencing, Agent Hutchinson approached us in the courthouse hallway. She told me the final asset recovery was complete. Between the offshore accounts and seized properties, they'd recovered 87% of the stolen funds for all sufferers. I asked about the other 13%. She said it was gone, but that was still the highest recovery rate they'd ever achieved in a case this complex. That afternoon, Patricia and I returned to Oceanic Depths. The business had grown beyond anything I'd imagined during my marriage. We now operated 3 boats, employed 8 dive instructors, and had contracts with both the Coast Guard and the FBI for underwater investigations. Patricia told me she had something to share. She'd been accepted to the Police Academy's Civilian Investigator program. I stared at her in surprise, pointing out she was 62 years old. She said exactly that she had life experience these young investigators lacked. Plus, someone needed to help families navigate the aftermath of financial crimes. I asked if this meant she was leaving Oceanic Depths. She said not leaving, expanding our services. Imagine a dive center that also provides sufferer advocacy and financial crime consultation. That evening, I called Melissa Hutchinson to discuss integrating sufferer services into our business model. She said I was creating something unique, a business that survived criminal attack and transformed into a force for justice. That was powerful. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Natasha's betrayal had accidentally created something valuable. Oceanic Depths wasn't just a diving business anymore. It was proof that honest people could survive sophisticated attacks and emerge stronger. The marriage might have been fake, but what I'd built from its ashes was completely real. 2 years after Natasha's conviction, I stood on the deck of our newest boat, the Integrity, watching my newest dive student practice equipment checks. She was nervous but determined, exactly the attitude needed for both diving and recovery from betrayal. Her name was Brielle Montgomery, a marine biologist who'd lost her research funding to a romance scammer 6 months earlier. She'd joined our sufferer support program and decided to learn diving as part of her healing process. Brielle said she was still afraid she'd panic underwater. I replied that fear is healthy, it keeps you alert. The goal isn't to eliminate fear, but to function effectively despite it. Patricia emerged from the cabin carrying updated certification paperwork. At 63, she'd completed both Police Academy training and advanced diving certification. Our business now offered something unprecedented: underwater investigation services combined with sufferer advocacy. Patricia told Brielle she was going to love the reef system, that I'd found 3 new artificial reefs last month during a Coast Guard investigation. Those reefs had been created using confiscated materials from Damian Blackwood's smuggling operation. Turning instruments of crime into habitats for marine life felt like poetic justice. As we descended into the crystal clear water, I watched Brielle's confidence grow. Underwater, pretense becomes impossible. You either trust your equipment and training, or you don't survive. After the dive, Brielle sat on the boat deck with tears in her eyes. She said she hadn't felt that peaceful in months. Down there, nothing else mattered except the present moment. I replied, that's why I love this work. The ocean doesn't care about your past. It only responds to who you are right now. That evening, Patricia and I reviewed applications for our new fellowship program offering free diving instruction and business mentorship to financial crime sufferers. 43 applications this month, Patricia said. We were changing lives, I corrected her, saying we were giving people tools to rebuild. They were doing the real work. My phone buzzed with a text from Agent Hutchinson. The Blackwood Network trial in Florida had resulted in 17 more convictions. My testimony had been crucial. She thanked me for seeing this through. As I typed my response, I reflected on how completely my life had transformed. 2 years ago, I'd been a betrayed husband discovering his spouse's infidelity. Now I was running a business that helped others recover from similar betrayals while providing critical services to law enforcement. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. Patricia answered it and returned with an envelope from the State Attorney General's office. Inside was an official commendation recognizing Oceanic Depths for exceptional service in combating organized crime and supporting sufferers of financial fraud. Patricia pointed to the letterhead, showing they were recommending us for a federal contract with the Justice Department. I studied the document, thinking about the journey that had brought us here. Natasha's betrayal had nearly destroyed me, but it had also revealed capabilities I never knew I possessed. I asked Patricia if she ever regretted helping me expose Natasha. She looked at me with the same steady gaze that had sustained me through the darkest period of my life. She said she regretted that her daughter had become someone who needed exposing, but she'd never regret choosing what was right. As we watched the last light fade over the harbor, I felt something I thought was lost forever. Absolute certainty about the people in my life and the work we were doing together. The water had taught me that trust, like diving, requires both courage and careful preparation. But when you find the right people and the right purpose, the depths become a place of discovery rather than danger. That's what I learned from the worst betrayal of my life, and that's what I'm passing on to everyone who walks through the doors of oceanic depths looking for a second chance.